I did step on an eyelash viper one time while I was climbing a tree in Costa Rica. I mean, in a rainforest, there's all kinds of things that bite you and can be dangerous. That was one moment where I thought I might never come back.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Yanoviak. We really appreciate you coming in and chatting with our class today. We're our AP Biology class. These are Lion, Lunch, and Learn. We are in the middle of, or actually towards the end of evolution. So I've told them a bit about you. We've done some research, told them about our good times in Peru. Dr. Yanoviak is at the University of Louisville. He's a biology professor. He's a researcher. He's the Tom Wallace Endowed Chair of Conservation. He is the, I think, most interesting, deepest thinker I know in biology, especially related to insects and the rainforest. Today, we're going to go through your questions, which will range from kind of personal adventure to berry ants, gliding ants, lightning ecology, swimming ants, and if we get to it, Canopy Ant Diversity. These would be the subjects that Dr. Yanoviak is most interested in. So y'all, let's give him a welcome.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm super happy to be able to talk with you today about all the cool things we've been working on in my lab and some of my life experiences, and hopefully help some of you make decisions about whether you want to pursue a career in biology or research.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much. Let's go ahead and start.
Hey, my name is Finner, and my question was, where did you grow up and how did that influence your career choice?
So I grew up in Pennsylvania outside of Philadelphia in the suburbs. There happened to be a small stream, a creek running next to my house, and I spent most of my childhood days digging around in that creek looking for crayfish and stuff. So I've actually just had a personal fascination with nature since the time I could walk, and that never went away, really. So nobody in my family is surprised at what I'm doing today, because I've always been kind of a critter person. Just liked having snakes and tanks and stuff like that in my house when I was growing up, and I just never lost that fascination.
Hello, my name's Gabrielle. My question was, what did you major in and what path did you take to end up where you currently are working?
Yeah, so I got my undergrad degree at Auburn University, and I initially enrolled as a pre-vet student, and I was a pre-vet student with a concentration in entomology. So I'm trying to think. It's been so many years. I'm trying to think about how it all got started. I actually started out as a pre-vet major in zoology, and I switched over to entomology because there were more scholarship opportunities for me working with insects than working with just a broader generalization in zoology. And it wasn't really until I thought I was going to be a veterinarian for the longest time. And I went to Auburn because they have a good vet school. But after I settled in there and started taking some classes and meeting some professors, it really became clear to me that research was the most exciting thing I could think about doing with my own life. So mostly just seeing the professors that I worked with and what the kind of work they were doing, and I just wanted to become that kind of person. So here I am.
My name's Malachi, and I was wondering, when you're out in the field on these type of trips looking at adaptations of organisms, how long are you typically out in the field and how long does it last?
Well, now that I'm older and I have a lab full of students, I don't go to the field as much. But when I was, I would say even just 10 years ago, when I had more time and was doing a lot of the work on my own, I would spend the entire summer in Panama. So I typically would leave as soon as classes ended in May, as soon as finals were over, I would leave in May and go to Panama, and I wouldn't come back until August. So typically 3 months at a time. And then every Christmas break, every spring break, whenever I could go, even for just a week at a time, I'd go down to the tropics.
And when you were on these trips, did you ever encounter danger, like an animal or a sickness?
Yeah, so probably the most I mean, in a rainforest, there's all kinds of things that bite you and can be dangerous. It's kind of a matter of balancing risk and hazard. The hazards exist, but the risk is not not very high. I did step on an eyelash viper one time while I was climbing a tree in Costa Rica. That was probably my most memorable experience because it really scared me. Um, uh, Fortunately for me, eyelash vipers are really docile snakes. If it had bit me, it would have been tragic. It's their venom is extremely powerful, but the snake itself is just not interested in biting unless it really has to. So I stepped right on it, and when I realized what had happened, I thought for sure I'd been bitten, but it never actually bit me. So then I took some pictures of it and moved on with my work that day. Um, there was one time we did an excursion in a boat. We were 200 miles off the coast of Costa Rica in the Pacific Ocean, and the motor on the boat died, and the owner of the boat used ether to get it started again, and that was one moment where I thought I might never come back from that trip, because if you put ether into a confined space and then have any source of spark, if you have any sort of spark, then that's going to create an explosion. And so I expected that we were going to die out there, and that never happened. But yeah, those are the two things that stand out in my memory as being pretty scary times for me.
Hello, I'm Gabriel Campbell, and I wanted to know what causes the parasite to make the ant resemble a berry.
Uh, Part of it is due to thinning of the body wall by the parasite. So these ants are black, and it's the black coloration comes from melanin in the tissues of the ant. One of the hypotheses we had was that the parasite actually somehow leaches out that melanin, so basically takes the pigment out of the exoskeleton of the insect. But it turns out that melanin is really hard to remove from something once it's there. So it's not like they can't do like a biochemical bleaching or anything on this ant. So then we started thinking, well, the other option would be that if you get the layer of the body wall so thin that light can pass through it, then it might be more of a reddish or yellowish color. And sure enough, if you get it thin enough, it looks like the color of a cockroach. It's kind of an amber color. And when sunlight shines on that, it gives you a very bright red coloration. It's just kind of an amazing phenomenon.
Hey, Steve, is that something you guys research like in the lab as opposed to outside in the field?
We did do that in the lab. Yeah, we brought the ants back to the lab, and we had ants that were not infected with the parasite, and we had ants that were infected with the parasite, and we basically we froze them, and then we sectioned them with a super sharp razor blade, super thin razor blade, took fine sections of the body wall to see if the cuticle, or basically their skin, was thicker in the uninfected ants versus the infected ants. So it's a nice little study.
Oh, wow.
Pretty simple study. Yeah.
My name is Helen, and my question is, do you think it would ever be possible for humans to have a manipulative parasite like the ants?
Well, there's a pretty good idea that we probably do already. So there's this parasite called Toxoplasma that lives. It's actually a parasite that cycles between cats and rats, but you can pick it up if your cat goes outside and is killing rats, and then it's using a litter box in your house. You have the potential to pick up the parasite from the litter. This is why it's often said that pregnant women should not be cleaning cat boxes because of the risk of exposure to toxoplasma. Some people have suggested that toxoplasma infections are really common in humans, that like maybe half of us already have it. You just don't know it. And that people who have acute infections of toxoplasma do have behavioral changes. They tend to be less afraid of danger and risk. the jury is still out on this. We don't have good evidence for it yet, and it's also, we're talking about human behavior. And whenever you do a study on human behavior, there's so many extraneous variables that confound the results. But it's really interesting to think about the possibility that this little protozoan parasite might actually be affecting human behavior, similar to what it does to rats. And you can imagine, this parasite would make rats less risk averse, and so they get eaten by cats more often.
Just wondering what the advantages were for the parasite to make the ant look like a berry, and if it was possible for like other species to eat that ant then and take on the parasite as well.
Yeah, so the idea of looking like a berry makes a bird basically make a mistake and eat that ant, thinking it's a red berry. Now, how does it benefit the parasite? The bird flies to a different location and basically poops out that parasite in its feces. And that's how the parasite is able to infect a new ant colony. So the parasite doesn't actually infect the bird just carries it to a new place. So that's the benefit that the parasite gets. Otherwise, you would have a parasite that existed in a single ant colony and never got transmitted to any other ant colonies in the world, and that would be a dead end evolutionarily. So you have to get gene transfer to new ant colonies so you can combine your genes with other parasites, other members of the species. And that's what they do for the parasite.
I'm Malik.
Oh, wait, hang on. Let me interrupt you real quick. So we'll transition over to gliding ants from berry ants, but I wanted to ask you, you mentioned toxoplasma. So toxoplasma is a protist, right? And the kind of fear lessening behavior, is that related at all to what's going on with Plasmodium and malaria, like with mosquitoes, when they're more or less likely to kind of bite a human to help spread or propagate once the parasite is reproduced, like in the salivary glands? We studied that a little bit, and I was wondering, is there any kind of connection there?
Not specifically with toxoplasma, but it's the same idea. Now, the way that the malaria works is it's much more physiological at its core, and the consequence is behavioral. So in the case of malaria, you get such a bad fever that you just don't want to move. And so the physiological effect of the parasite is to create this bad fever, which consequently makes you really good, easy prey for mosquitoes, right? And then the malaria parasite also changes the behavior of the mosquito by clogging up its mouth parts, so that the mosquito, instead of landing on you, and maybe you're not infected, okay, so you have no malaria, the mosquito lands on you and feeds for 20 minutes and gets a full blood meal and then flies away and lays her eggs, and everything is fine. That's just nature runs its course. But if you have malaria involved, then the mosquito is more likely to stop feeding before it's full. So it feels like it's getting enough blood, but it doesn't get enough. And so it actually will fly away, and then it's got to feed on another host. It's got to get more blood and more blood. And so what's happening is the malaria is causing the mosquito to visit more humans than it normally would. And that's how you get transmission. Yeah.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right. Let's check out gliding ants.
I'm Malik, and I was wondering how far gliding ants can glide, and if so, is their eyesight actually like good enough to see where they're gliding to? And can they hold food while gliding, or will they be too encumbered to even glide?
Yeah, so the longest distance that I've actually seen them glide is probably about 10 meters or so, maybe 12 meters. So it's only about 30 feet. And I'm talking about the horizontal trajectory, the vertical trajectory. So how far they fall is long. I mean, that might be 15 or 20 meters, but the horizontal part of it, typically it's only like 4 or 5 meters, because what happens is they hit another tree. if you took an ant like out to a platform or something where you had an isolated tree and dropped it, I think you might be able to get them to go as far as like probably 8 or 10 meters. I'm guessing. It's hard to say. They need a lot of height in order to glide because really what they're doing is directing their fall, and they use their legs to do it. So they wouldn't be able to do this if they're holding any kind of food. They could have maybe a mouthful of food, but I think that would affect their aerodynamics so much that they probably wouldn't fly very well.
So I was wondering, like, how the ants were capable of accurate gliding without wings, and if they like are able to glide because they're so light, or if they evolved structurally to be able to glide.
Yeah, so they actually gliding is entirely a behavioral thing. So there's really nothing about the ants, as far as we can tell, that is specifically a modification, or at least an anatomical modification for gliding. Now, what they do is take advantage of pre-existing morphology. So for lots of reasons, these ants have kind of a flattened body shape. They have flanges on the sides of the head. They have their legs, their feet are kind of flattened. And so they use all these other characteristics that already exist in the ant to their advantage when they glide. That's why they wouldn't be able to glide if they're holding on to something like another ant or a piece of food. Basically, what they're doing is they're fairly lightweight. They don't have a lot of surface area relative to other things. So basically, all these things I'm mentioning are factored into what's called a Reynolds number. So the Reynolds number is basically a measure of how much drag you produce when you're falling through the air or through water. And we talk about something the size of an insect will have a very low Reynolds number, and so there's not a lot of opportunity for aerodynamics to develop. So it's really kind of falling like a rock. And it just so happens to be that if you put some legs on a rock and you tilt them in just the right way, you can make that rock glide at a horizontal angle. So that's basically what's happening with these insects. I say a rock, more like a pebble. They're pretty tiny.
I was wondering, how does the mechanism for gliding differ between gliding ants, gliding bristletails, and gliding spiders? And like, what environmental pressures help to shape this adaptation?
Yeah, so the easier question to answer there is the environmental pressure. So it's probably a way to avoid predation. And in the case of the ants, it's a way to avoid becoming lost. But in all cases, the bristletails, the spiders, and the ants, I would say for the bristletails and the spiders, because they're not social animals, they're basically living on their own. They're gliding to mostly escape a predator in a tree, but then also avoid landing in the understory at the base of the tree. Because in the Amazon, for example, the understory might be full of water and fish that they're gonna eat everything that hits the water right away. Even if you land in leaf litter on the ground, that leaf litter is full of lizards and other ants and things that are going to eat you as soon as you get down there. It's dark and it's different. It's not what they're used to. So for the spiders and the bristletails and for the ants, basically they're trying to avoid getting eaten when they're up in a tree, but then also avoid getting eaten when they're on the ground. And so they escape from one part of the tree and land on another part of the tree, and they're golden.
All right, we're going to transition to lightning ecology.
Okay.
Just jumping around a little bit today.
Sure.
I was wondering if there's like any species that actually benefit off lightning strikes that would affect like the canopy.
We're working on a publication right now where it does appear that there are certain tree species that actually benefit from lightning. But when it comes to the insects, the only obvious possibility for an insect benefiting from a lightning strike would be beetles. So we already know that this happens with pine trees in the U.S. So when you get down into Florida and the Carolinas, and there's lots of pine trees, lightning is a huge killer of pine trees, but very often it's not actually what kills the tree initially. What kills the tree is the beetles that attack the tree after it's been damaged by lightning. So all this is to say that lightning is an important source of tree damage that is then attractive to certain species of beetles. So that's something that we know happens in the US, but nobody's ever looked at that in the tropics. And so that's something that we're hoping to work on now. As far as the trees go, yeah, there appears to be there's definitely one, but maybe a handful of tree species that seem to benefit from lightning strikes because the lightning doesn't kill the tree, but it kills all the trees around it. And so it destroys or interferes with competition that would otherwise occur for that tree.
Hi, I'm Alicia. I was wondering if there could be other factors or organisms aside from lianas that protect trees from lightning strikes.
So far, we haven't seen anything. We do know that some, like I just mentioned, some tree species seem to be immune from lightning or relatively immune from it. And that probably has something to do with the structure of the wood or the structure of their vessels that transport the fluids within the tree. Or even, their bark structure or the way that the crown is shaped. Something like that could be a factor affecting whether or not they survive or die from a lightning strike.
My name is Ian, and I was wondering, is lightning a frequent enough occurrence that it causes that it acts as a selective pressure towards trees?
We think it is, yeah. And it's funny, before we started studying lightning in the tropics, nobody ever really thought about it as being frequent enough or predictable enough that it could actually be a selective pressure. But when we did the calculations, and if you think about how long a tropical tree can live as a member of the canopy, so this means it's a big tree, it's like 100 feet tall, and its crown is going to be exposed to the atmosphere and lightning. They live, maybe 500 years, maybe longer. And during that lifespan, some of them are getting struck 50 or 60 times in their lifetime. It's kind of amazing. When we did the calculations, we couldn't believe it. Every individual tree in the forest is getting struck by lightning that often over its entire lifespan. So yes, it definitely could be a selective pressure.
Now, do you see differences, or is it possible to see differences, like as a gradient related to how common lightning strikes are in that area?
Absolutely. So that's one of the things that we're trying to put together now. We know that the place in Panama where we study lightning is really common. And so you would expect that if you go to different tropical forests that have different amounts of lightning, you might see different tree species composition, or you might see different levels of resistance to lightning and survivorship, following a lightning event. Yeah.
My name is Patrick, and my question is, does climate change increase the frequency of lightning strikes and further the threat to forested areas?
The evidence so far says yes. So this is not the kind of work that I do, but we collaborate with people who study these kinds of things. And basically, the mathematical models that predict how clouds develop, how thunderstorms develop, suggest that in a warmer atmosphere, you're going to get more lightning, especially in the tropics. And if that happens, then all of the work we're doing would have important predictive power, I think, for the way that forests would look in the future. Now, basically, the way this works, lightning is formed because you have ice crystals up in the higher levels of clouds, and those ice crystals rub together, kind of like if you rub a balloon on a sweater and you generate a static shock. It's the same idea. You're just generating charges in a cloud, and the basic idea is that in a warmer atmosphere, you have higher cloud tops, and you also have, if I recall correctly, you have higher cloud bases, and you actually have more intense lightning as a consequence of that. So it basically comes down to the morphology of clouds in a warmer atmosphere.
Excellent. We're going to go to swimming ants next.
Okay.
I have a question. What allows the ants to swim, and is it only due to surface tension, or did they adapt to swim in water in the forest?
So it is really all about surface tension. So the ants themselves are manipulating surface tension to their advantage, very much like you and I would be rowing a boat. So ultimately, buoyancy of the boat, the collective surface tension of water molecules is keeping the boat afloat, and you're pushing against the density of water with boat oars to move yourself forward. And ants do basically the same thing. Now, for something the size of an ant, the surface tension forces in a relative sense are much greater than they are for a person in a boat. Is it an adaptation? So that was one of the questions we were trying to answer. So what we were looking at was, when an ant is on water and it's swimming, is it basically just walking? I mean, does it even know it's on water? Is it just walking like it would walk on land? If so, that tells you there's no special swimming behavior in an ant. They just are stuck, and so they try to move the only way that they know how. We did find, though, that in certain ants, they actually do a different leg motion when they're on the water. So that would say, yeah, okay, they are probably swimming. They probably are adapted to dealing with water, which kind of makes sense if you live in a rainforest. Water is everywhere.
So another one of my questions is, out of all the ants that you studied, why did only the carpenter ant evolve to be able to both swim and glide?
Good question. Carpenter ants, they're fairly what we would call basal or sort of primitive among ants, and they occupy. A lot of them will live in dead wood on the ground and then forage up in the trees. Some of them forage or live in dead wood up in the trees and forage on the ground. And so I think it's just because they have such a broad diversity of niches, we would say, different lifestyles, that it is the one group that shows the most diverse behaviors when we look at gliding and swimming.
So my name is Rose Only, and my question is, was this separate evolution due to convergent evolution or reproductive isolation?
Can you ask me that again?
Was this separate evolution due to convergent evolution or reproductive isolation?
It's more likely due to convergence. So what we see in the case of ants is the same behavior occurring in a lot of groups that are not really closely related. And so that would, we actually, because it all happens in ants, we call it parallel evolution. But it's also, you could look at it in terms of convergent evolution. Yeah.
My name is Kira, and my question is, what is the science behind Skototaxis? Do all ants have this, or just the ones that have the ability to swim?
I don't know if all ants have it. So Skototaxis is simply a funny word for directing your motion towards a dark object. And it probably makes sense for a lot of ants to exhibit Skototaxis. If you're walking around on the forest floor and you see a dark object on the horizon, that probably is going to be a tree trunk. And so whether or not you're in water, I mean, certainly if you're in water, there would be very strong selective pressure to go to a dark object so you can get out of the water as soon as possible. But I don't know. That's an excellent question, and I'm trying to think of how we would test it. We could test that in the lab. We would just get some ants that don't swim and put them on a dry chamber, like basically a dry swimming pool, and put some dark objects on their perimeter of it and see if they orient towards the dark objects. I bet you they would. It's probably a widespread behavior.
Oh, cool. Hey, the next question I'll actually ask for a student here. For Canopy Ant Diversity, why are there so many different varieties of canopy ants, and how have they evolved differently, / what different environmental pressures have caused the ants to have so many variations? This maybe would have worked a little bit better earlier, but probably relates to berry ants and gliding and swimming ants. But yeah, in general for canopy ants.
No, it's a great question, great thought experiment. So um, it actually has broader implications. We often ask the question, why are there so many species in the tropics? If you want to see really high diversity on the planet, for most groups, not for every group, but for most groups, whether it's salamanders or birds or butterflies, you go to the tropics. That's where the highest diversity is. So the burning question is why? Well, one hypothesis for that, and why do we find 10 different species of ants in a tree in the tropics, and why do we find 150 different species of ants in a whole forest canopy in the tropics? Well, presumably they're occupying different niches, so they're using slightly different resources from each other, and it's probably largely the result of competing for different things. So if you have two species that want the same food, and that food limits how many offspring they can have, then one of them has got to switch to some other kind of food eventually, because ultimately the competition is going to be negative for bad, or bad for both of them. So that's ultimately, over a long period of time, how you get divergence among species. And we have, for example, there are canopy ants that nest in the canopy and forage on the ground. There are ants that nest in the ground and forage in the canopy. And there are ants that really don't like to be out in bright light, and others that like to be in a very high light environment. And so that's how we get all these, these variations in behavior and morphology are just driven by different organisms trying to share the same space. They all have to be slightly different from each other in order to coexist.
Can I ask you a quick, maybe a guess at some numbers? Any
Sure.
idea how many canopy ant species there are in Panama, and then maybe what percentage you think are known versus unknown?
Oh, yeah. Well, somebody actually measured this for Costa Rica, which is actually, the forest is quite similar to Panama. And in Costa Rica, they found about 400 to 450 total ant species present in the rainforest there. And they estimated that about up to 40% of those were canopy species, somewhere between 30 and 40%. So in Panama, we found 150 plus or minus species of ants that we consider to be canopy species. And there definitely are species in that group that are not known to science yet. So there's somebody, I found a species of ant in Peru that somebody's going to name after me eventually. I don't know that it'll ever happen, but yeah, so we occasionally stumble across new species when we're working there. Yeah.
All right.
My question is, what are some of the most interesting or complex behaviors that ants exhibit?
Well, it's funny, I think anybody who's ever taken some time to just watch an ant like do anything, it's kind of amazing. I mean, they're like little machines, They go out there and they'll tear apart a piece of food, and they work together to carry it back to the nest, and they talk to each other chemically. They don't have to do anything except touch each other with their antennae. They can transmit messages that way. And of course, I think the gliding stuff is amazing. Nobody would really expected that to happen. It was one more example of just how amazing something as small as an ant can be. So I don't know that I have a favorite like crazy cool behavior that ants do, but there's some neat stuff going on with ants out there. And Yeah, a lot of it, I think, just comes down to how they communicate and how they manipulate their environment. It's pretty amazing.
Okay, so I have another question. I was
Yeah.
wondering, sorry, how could this work have a broader scientific application?
Yes, I think that was falling under the Canopy Ant section. And whenever we do any kind of research in my lab, that's one of the things that I talk to my students about all the time is that we need to put this into a broader context. A lot of science is done just for the sake of science, just for the sake of knowing something. It can be very esoteric. Um, and so it's important to recognize that people want to know, why does this matter? Why should I care about gliding ants, or why should I care about canopy ant diversity? The canopy ant diversity questions are important for us because we don't really know very much at all about how. We know that there's all this diversity in tropical rainforests, but we don't know really what its origins are or what regulates that diversity. So what prevents a tree from having 200 species of ants in it? Why is it always like roughly 10 or so that we see? And who determines, or what determines, the number of my cat's here talking too. What determines which species coexist in a given tree in the rainforest? And so these are the kinds of questions that we can answer with the work that we're doing. The berry ant question, the berry ant project is really helpful because it reveals an aspect of diversity in the rainforest that nobody even really thought about. And that was this extra layer of diversity that exists in the parasites. And then for swimming ants and gliding ants, again, that was kind of just, again, revealing all the really cool things that exist in rainforests that we just don't know anything about yet. And so we sorted all of that stuff out.
My second question was, have you ever explored how the different components of the forest canopy influence ant diversity in other areas of the world, and how do they compare to areas that you studied?
Yeah, so we had a chance to go to Africa once and do some similar surveys, looking mostly for gliding behavior in ants, but also just looking at how many ants can we find in a tree. And um, similarly with the lightning work, we've got some projects going on through my collaborator. He's got projects going on over in Africa right now, looking at how the forest is affected by lightning there. So yeah, we're trying to expand beyond the neotropics into other tropical locations. And it was interesting to go to Africa just because the ants, there's a lot of evidence for convergence over there. A lot of the ants that I was looking at look really similar to the things I was seeing over in Panama and Costa Rica. And so that was kind of amazing. It's like, wow, I would expect things to be really different over on a different continent, and yet there was a lot of similarity. So uh, different species for sure, but morphologically, a lot of them look very similar.
Awesome. Hey, this might end up being our last question. I'm kind of curious, even following what you're saying with Africa and some collaborators, can you comment on kind of the need for integration between biology and chemistry and physics and the work that you do and kind of things that you learn from others and the kind of continuing education and endless learning that you're doing, whether it's kind of Reynolds number and the drag or your interest in physics and surface tension. How do you manage that?
Yeah, so people like the lightning project especially, and the gliding ant work, because it is very integrative. So I had to collaborate with physicists and people who study fluid dynamics and people who study atmospheric processes. So all of that, was really rewarding for me. And it's hard to get everybody together in the same room, but we make it happen, and it's been really great.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Yanoviak, you are the best. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Let's say thank you so much.
Thank you for having me and for making this possible.
You're welcome, Steve. Yeah, I'll talk to you soon, all right?
All right. Take care.
Take care.